Hey guys, I thought my subscribers would be interested in hearing about how I became a Railfan. I now have over 5,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel, and this is my thanks to all of you. There are three major factors that made me the train fanatic that I am today. First is my grandfather, and second is Thomas the Tank Engine, and third are Lionel Trains. My great-grandfather was an engineer on a logging locomotive in the 1920s and 30s on the Brooks Scanlon Lumber Company that ran in a small town near Jacksonville, Florida. I always loved hearing a story my grandpa told me about a time when he was around 10 years old and him and a friend of his saw that the locomotive that my great-grandfather ran was left unattended. They climbed up in the cab and my grandpa pulled the throttle. However, the hostler had just finished getting the fire going, and after it had been banked for the night. And when he did this, all of the fire that the hostler had gotten started was immediately pulled through the tubes and out the smokestack, putting the fire out. About that time, the hostler came back and was furious because the kindling was a decent walk from the engine, and he would have to start all over again making the fire. According to my grandpa, he let a string of colorful language escape from his mouth as my grandfather and his friend ran off. Later that evening, when the day was over, the hostler came to the small company house that my grandfather and his parents and siblings lived in, which was more of a shack from what my grandfather told me, and he angrily told my great-grandfather about what my grandpa had done, and he wanted him punished. He left the house in a bad temper, and my great-grandfather, who thought my grandpa had suffered enough and had learned his lesson, merely chuckled and left the house. Another story told to me by my grandfather was about my great-grandmother, who was driving down to the yard one day in their rickety Model T where my great-grandfather was shunting log cars. She was bringing him something to eat and was known to be a crazy driver. Apparently, he was approaching a crossing and she was not paying attention and drove right into the side of the locomotive, even though he was blowing the whistle. Once he found out she was unhurt, he was very unhappy as the car was banged up pretty good and they had very little money. In the end, they just lived with the car being beat up because they couldn't afford to fix it. The engine was unhurt. The last story I have of my great-grandfather and his logging locomotive was that one day he was running a log train from the mill that was an extra, and the manager of the road had come down and needed to go into the mill. There were no roads that went to the mill, so he took the pump cart and did not check the schedule to see that there was an unscheduled run out of the mill and headed down the line. My great-grandfather had just started out of the mill down the rough track and was rounding a corner when he saw the pump car coming at him from the other direction. He leaned on the whistle and hit the brakes, but it was too late. Luckily, the manager had jumped clear as the pump car was hit with the locomotive and flew off the line and was destroyed. The manager was furious, even though it was his fault since he had not checked the schedule. Luckily, no one was hurt. My grandpa also told me that they were very bad about overloading the trains, and my great-grandfather had to really struggle to get trains moving and would often slip and slide trying to get traction. This made it more difficult to stop the train due to the excess weight behind the locomotive. Sadly, I never met my great-grandfather. He died before I was born, but he was apparently quite the character, and I was very excited to find out as a teen that 3 of the locomotives that my great-grandfather had run still existed. First is number 3, 262, built by Baldwin in 1914, that is now on display in Zolfo Springs, Florida. Next is number 1, a 262 built by Baldwin in 1914, that is now on display in Scranton, Pennsylvania at the Steamtown National Historic Site. And last is number 2, the 262, built by Baldwin in 1913. This was my great-grandfather's primary locomotive, and I was so excited in 2001 to find out that this locomotive was still around thanks to the magic of the internet, which was still fairly in its infancy. Now on to the main things that influenced me to become a rail fan. In 1989, my grandpa took me to the Georgia Museum of Agriculture in Tifton, Georgia. It's affectionately known as Agorama. At the time, they had only one operating steam locomotive, an 040 tank engine, number 5, built by the Vulcan Iron Works in 1917. I have a memory of getting out of the car and seeing smoke wafting up from behind the entrance building and getting excited. After we got into the park, Grandpa took me up to the engine, and this photo of me, my sister, and my grandpa in front of the engine was taken by my grandmother. We never actually got to ride the locomotive that day, though. They were having some kind of mechanical issues and could never get enough steam up to make the engine move more than a few feet. But I still love this locomotive to this day, and it's one of my favorite steam engines, and the very first one I ever saw under steam. In 1990, we went to the Strasburg Scenic Railroad in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, where 060 number 31 was running, a Canadian-built locomotive. Sadly, I have little to no memory of this trip, so mostly all I have is this picture my grandma took of number 31 running. But I am still a big Strasburg Railroad fan to this day, and I do really enjoy going there. Moving on to 1991, in Blowing Rock, North Carolina and the Tweetsie Railroad, my grandpa had taken my mom and her sisters here in the 1960s when they were kids, and my grandpa knew that my sister and I would love the theme park and all the rides, and that I would love the train. I remember vividly standing by the tracks and hearing the bell and seeing ex-ET&WNC 460 number 12, 1917 Baldwin, round the curve and blow her shrill whistle for the station. It was so loud that I remember hiding behind my grandpa because it scared me. But once the train had stopped and my grandpa took me up to the engine to get a better look, I was hooked immediately. And to this day, number 12 is my all-time favorite steam locomotive, and I still love seeing her run. I also have a memory of the other locomotive that Tweetsie Railroad owns, a 282 number 190. I remember it sitting behind the shop area, painted black. I think this has to be a faulty memory, since the only year that 190 was painted black at Tweetsie was her very first season of operation in 1960. So I'm either remembering it wrong, or the boiler jacket was off the locomotive, giving it the illusion of being painted black. Moving on a few years, in 1995, my grandpa took me to the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad in Durango, Colorado. This was by far the longest train ride I had ever taken, and seeing so many operating steam engines in one place at one time was an amazing sight to me. I remember McDonald's across the street had a play area next to the rail yard and had a tube maze. At one of the sections had a window that looked out over the rail yard, and I sat in there for a while watching the trains run around the yard, and I pretended I was the engineer. Locomotive number 473 was the locomotive running that day. This engine was a 282 built by Alco in 1923, and to this day is still one of my favorite Rio Grande locomotives. To this day, the DNS&G is my favorite surviving historic railroad line and helped to contribute to my love of narrow gauge railroads. The same year in 1995, we also visited the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad in Chalma, New Mexico. Locomotives 484 and 488 were running that day, and they both are 282s built by Baldwin in 1925. 488 is my favorite Rio Grande locomotive. For some reason, my memories of the CNTS are not as vivid as they are of the DNS-NG, but I still do love the CNTS. Ironically, on the same trip, we'd gone to the Grand Canyon before we went to Durango, Silverton, or Cumbres and Toltec, and I had no idea that there was a steam train that operated there, neither did my grandfather. And we had gone down to the eating area that was at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and we'd gone in to eat breakfast. Well, while we were eating, I heard a steam whistle, and when we got done, I went outside with my grandpa, and we saw the locomotive sitting there. At the time, the railroad was using 280 Alco number 18. I was so excited that this steam locomotive was sitting there, especially because it was an unscheduled thing. I had no idea it was going to be there. Unfortunately, I was a little upset because we were not going to get to ride it, but my grandpa assured me that I would get to ride a couple of different trains in a few days when we went to Durango, Silverton, so I was okay with it. But the funny thing is that Grandpa had to just about stop me from chasing the train as it departed from the south rim of the Grand Canyon back towards Williams. And I do have a couple of photographs of number 18 as I walked along after it trying to catch up with it. Years later, in 2017, I did finally get to go and Railfan the Grand Canyon Scenic Railroad, although they no longer own Alco 18. Like I said earlier, I loved Thomas the Tank Engine as a kid, and I watched it religiously starting around kindergarten. I also, to this day, enjoy the older Thomas the Tank Engine videos that were filmed on the real model railroad and didn't use CGI. I really enjoy the Strasburg Railroad Thomas since it's a real steam engine. It may not be as visually accurate as the dummy Thomas units that have to be pushed, but to me, the steam-powered Thomas is the real Thomas the Tank. The last big factor in my love of trains are Lionel Trains. My grandpa had won a Lionel 442 starter set from his company and gave it to me when I was young. Also, my dad had a Lionel 040 tank engine set that he gave to me around the same time. I ran these two on my small layout in my bedroom for years. These were not the most realistic model trains ever, but they sure were a lot of fun. And I still have these engines today. And even though, like I said, they're not as realistic as a lot of other model trains these days, I still love these two engines as they were the first model trains I ever owned. To this day, I still model in O scale and now also in ON30, which is a narrow gauge version of O scale. Anyway, I hope you all liked the video on how I became a big train fan that I am today. I could go on for hours about my Railfan history and about stories from my childhood and about my grandpa, but this was just a little insight into how it all began. Please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for more Railfan content. Thanks.